Good evening and welcome. It's my pleasure to be talking to fellow representatives of the cattle industry. My name is Gordon-Manley and I'm a student at the University of Queensland studying agriculture science, and I'm also an agribusiness banker that has been working with cattle industry stakeholders for the past 2 years. Today I'll be discussing the key role that agriculture biosecurity plays in a national context with a focus on the cattle industry. The presentation, as per my outline, will detail what is biosecurity, why is it important, and what is Australia's risk, with again that key focus on the cattle industry. It will also emphasise the triple bottom line or the long-term sustainability of the industry. Let's begin. So what is biosecurity? Biosecurity has been utilised a lot within the primary industry. While it can become a bit confusing, its basic level or simplest form is prevention or protection against biological hazards. Australia's primary focus on this is divided into 3 key areas. 1. Prevention. This is prevention of introduction to Australia or in specific to your herd. This is prevention of the spreading. Secondly, this is a decrease in biosecurity risk. Through adequate management practices and the introduction of biosecurity principles, you can mitigate the majority of biological hazard risk. And thirdly, this is effective response management to outbreaks or biological hazards. Why is biosecurity so important? The series of steps and measurements used to protect us against biological hazards minimises and mitigates their potential negative influence. Australia, especially due to its island isolation, has a fortune to not have some exotic hazards which many countries have limited market access and lower productivity as a result of. This lack of disease presence provides Australia with a positive provenance brand, characterised by clean, green and most importantly, safe. For the cattle industry, which exports 70% of its production, damage to this reputation and limitation of access to markets would devastate the industry. Additionally, localised outbreaks of biological hazards can reduce yields, decrease quality and devastate local communities. A key example of a recent outbreak as a result of biosecurity failure is a white spot in prawns. In the recent decade, imported contaminated prawns have introduced a not previously present disease to some Australian regions. An outbreak in 2017 in the Logan and Brisbane rivers shut down production in the region. While a clear negative impact can be seen, what is often forgot is the social impact of the 122 jobs lost and the devastation to the local communities. Additionally, the lack of management in the region as a result has had detrimental coastal environmental influence. The federal response to this was 2 months too late. There was 2 months of imported product that continued to flood the Australian market and continued to damage Australia. I hope I've adequately emphasised how important biosecurity is to Australian agriculture. So the question becomes, what does biosecurity look like in Australia? Australia has some range of legislation, as the ones detailed on the side, that protect it from a range of biological hazards being introduced or imported. The island isolation of Australia, in addition with its strict import laws and border quarantine, ensures that many diseases and other biological hazards are not introduced. These strict controls have resulted in Australia having minimal biosecurity hazards, such as the one provided in the example before. Additionally, investment into additional industry bodies has resulted in many industries having support to ensure they have a biological program or a biosecurity program to prevent the spread of diseases. However, biosecurity in the cattle industry looks very different, and that can be stated as a lack of. While the cattle industry has an NLIS, National Livestock Identification Scheme, which traces a cattle from its birth to its slaughter, allowing traceability of any diseases, there are very many programs that are only voluntary. Programs such as the JPAS, which protects Australia against bovine Johne's disease, is voluntary. To use JPAS as an example, BJD, or bovine Johne's disease, is not endemic, but it is endemic to America, Canada and Japan. This provides us with an international advantage, yet very little of Australia is doing anything about it and ensuring the prosperity of this reputation and disease-free advantage. Many organisations perform research and development and provide guidance in relation to how you should treat biosecurity. Organisations like Meat Livestock Australia and Animal Health Australia have clear guidelines on what to do. However, again, this is only voluntary, and without legislation, there is no key incentive to actually follow this. So what is the cattle industry risking by taking such an apathetic approach to biosecurity? The diagram you can now see is a snapshot of 24 hours of movement of cattle in Victoria. This shows how easily and quickly a biological hazard carried by one single animal can spread across a state. The introduction of such a biological hazard can have a range of negative impacts, which include 1. Loss of productivity and increased expenses associated with treatment. 2. Time consumption for management and potential exposure to humans. 3. Decreased welfare and local impact on the land. Those 3 points that I have detailed underline how inadequate biosecurity can negatively influence the triple bottom line of an individual enterprise. But the real risk lays in the outbreak of a major national disease across the industry, which, in the following example, can result in cattle prices dropping by 80% overnight. In 2001, the United Kingdom had an outbreak of foot and mouth disease. I'm sure you're all familiar with this case. Foot and mouth is a zoonotic disease that is aggressive and required the culling of over 6 million cows and sheep to eventually hold it. An outbreak of foot and mouth disease would have a range of negative impacts that the red meat industry may not recover from. This includes eradicating our preferential market access and destroying Australians' premium provenance branding, not just in the meat industry, but again, across the Australian food service. This is in addition to the huge negative animal welfare impact. The scenario of foot and mouth outbreak has been investigated time and time again to emphasise the importance of biosecurity. As can be seen in the diagram, the cost to the Australian economy of a large impact could cause up to $52 billion of damages. This doesn't even detail the social impact of the communities and families which depend on the industry. Yet, even with this knowledge, implementation and adoption across the industry is low. On farm, we need to overcome our fear of expenses because the expense of inaction is too high. We need to increase and legislate basic biosecurity measures. This includes on-farm biosecurity plans that prevents the introduction of a biological hazard, such as the outbreak of parasites. We need to enforce the national health declarations for all traded animals, minimizing the initial spread of biological hazards such as bovine Johne's disease. And we need to secure our borders to ensure a scenario like the outbreak of foot and mouth disease just doesn't happen. Yet even with this knowledge, and more we see the importance of biosecurity, the existing funding and resourcing is decreasing nationally. The cattle industry is focusing on the short term and pushing hard against that legislation that will increase any costs. As seen by the quote, existing funding and resources are currently inadequate and won't support the national biosecurity system into the future. Words like this should really scare the agriculture industry. We rely on our reputation, we rely on being productive, and we have some of the highest costs internationally, so ensuring that our food is clean, safe, and we are a productive industry ensures that we can be competitive. So in conclusion, biosecurity plays a large role in safeguarding Australian agriculture from biological hazards such as disease outbreaks and damage to industry reputation. The Australian cattle industry especially relies on this strong international brand and needs to ensure the longevity through adequate employment of biosecurity. Internationally, Australia is recognised for its strong biosecurity legislation and import laws, which has definitely minimised our national risk. But as seen by the outbreak of white prawn disease, Australia's biosecurity has weaknesses and needs to further develop itself to ensure across-industry sustainability. The current lack of adoption and apathy found in the cattle industry is exposing it to huge risk, and risk that is preventable. The economic risk of not acting are too high, and it's easy to forget the social and environmental impacts of lax biosecurity. Agriculturists are the land carers and are pillars of many of our communities. Any negative influence on them has a negative impact across Australia. An ideal market-led movement or legislative framework would minimise the exposure and ensure the long-term sustainability of Australian agriculture and the cattle industry. I want to finish this presentation by emphasising how passionate I am about biosecurity and how important it is to every industry, especially our own industry, the cattle industry. I appreciate your time and I look forward to any questions so I can elaborate on what we can do. I can elaborate on how our country needs to react. Thank you. To finalise this presentation, I'll be utilising a mock question time. While the questions are pre-prepared, the answers are off the cuff, and I'm sure you'll see mistakes as I answer them. The first question is, the increase in cost is a huge prohibition to adoption. How is it economically feasible? This question really hits an underlying discussion point in my seminar, which is that farmers are really adverse to adoption of a lot of technologies and research and development. Additionally, they're quite expense adverse, and they can see the expenses associated with increased time, increased measurements, and increased procedures to ensure that their farm is biologically secure. However, what they're forgetting is the reputational risk, the industry risk, the productivity impacts, negative productivity impacts that occur from biological outbreaks. So a biosecurity measure really protects you against that. And that's how you've got to look at it. You've got to look at it long term and not say that short term thinking of, oh, it's going to be expensive. Say that long term thinking of we're safeguarding our future, we're ensuring long term productivity, etc. The second question is, why not let the market change over time by itself? Australia has demonstrated that it's a leader in research and development, but as you can see in the industry, I'm sure as much of my audience know who are cattle industry stakeholders, very little of it can be translated on farm and very little of it can be adopted. So while I'd love to say that biosecurity measures can be industry-led movements, even though there are some great industry-led movements, I believe adoptions, especially from smaller pockets, will not occur. And this will result in the whole industry being at risk. That's why I think legislation is really important, because it forces laggard individuals, those who are not adopting, those who are not progressing, to have to actively move or potentially be out of the industry. Biosecurity is that important, and the reputational risk and potential productivity loss from disease outbreaks is that negatively impactful that, yeah, I believe some people will have to be pushed out to ensure that we can progress as a nation. The final question is, how does Australia compare to its global competition, and is it really necessary? This is a good question because Australia is a leader in biosecurity. We have great legislation, our import and exports are second to none, and that in addition with our island isolation means that we haven't actually been impacted by a range of things that can cross borders and over in other countries. However, even though we're a real international leader, we shouldn't really look at other countries and use them as benchmarks. Australia should base it on what does the industry actually need and what will secure our long-term sustainability. And biosecurity needs to have the legislation built upon that view rather than, oh, this country doesn't do it. Yeah, I think that answers that question. There's 3 questions that I believe could be presented. Thank you for your time, and I hope you review my references, and if you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to email me, which will be provided at the end of this presentation.